Oh, you're still muted.
You keep clicking it. Now, did I get it off finally?
Yep, you're off. Yep, you're
All
good.
right. And do I have the picture with David DeBarthe on it?
No, you have you and Rena.
Whoop. Well, let's try again here. How about
There
now?
it is. Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, family, and visitors, delighted to welcome all of you this evening to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, now in its fourth year. I would like to call your attention to the photo first, because it's the picture of David DeBarthe standing beside Paul DeBarthe, standing beside Rena DeBarthe, standing beside Lee Orne in Pennsylvania. When we made the trip to Palmyra for the John Whitmer presentation, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, that picture was taken. And so that at least will give you a glimpse of David in that context. But let me tell you about him in just a little bit. He is my big brother and has been all my life. He's 10 years older and a lot wiser. But we've worked together on this presentation, and I'm delighted with the technical prowess that he's brought into it. He has degrees in engineering and in earth science with an emphasis in geology and meteorology. He taught earth science for a decade prior to becoming the computer center director for Graceland University. He retired after 4 decades to spend more time assisting with the archaeology at Nauvoo and in caring for his wife in 61 years, now 61. He previously presented on the Malay thesis by Dr. Olson and regularly participates in the forum. His diverse interests include hosting a theology discussion on Tuesday evenings, and Wednesday joins us with that frequently. So we're really curious to mention that Tuesday evening and call Wednesday's attention to it. He and his wife Jan live in Lamoni, Iowa, where they raised their family, and 2 of their 3 children have earned PhDs. Their daughter Linda spent some 20 years at Graceland teaching, and she's at Northeast Iowa. I'm not sure what the university is.
Northern Iowa University.
Thank you. And so without further ado, let's proceed with the prayer. Creator of mountains, valleys, streams, and rivers that flow to the sea, we marvel at the beautiful diversity your creations have brought to be, with ducks and geese, hummingbirds, bumblebees, and spruce trees, beautiful autumn colors, deserts, coral reefs, life that can withstand the freeze. We live in a world with wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, and in the hearts of men in many a nation, and recognize you call us to learn new languages of peace, patience, and compassion. Yet our traditions bog us down, limiting our ability to think, confining us to harsh competitiveness where we need to learn cooperatively to interlink. So this evening, we ask your blessing to help free us from the swamps that hold us in their mire, that we might see the beautiful overview of life your purposes help us acquire, that we might more fully grasp the vision you would have us see, that your intent for us is not war, but eternal life and immortality. And we thank you for the gift and pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, I have an appendix to add to the end, but we'll save that for, let me just note that we have the Book of Mormon base of this presentation in the fact that the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon was published in one of the sites that we're talking about tonight. And I'll add that appendix after David has given the presentation. And I need to stop sharing. Okay, David?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I don't know where you got that picture, but okay. I try to be the one behind the camera most of the time, so I know he has a hard time finding a good picture of me, but that's a good start. Okay, I've opened my presentation. If you can see it, if anybody can't see it, you better speak up.
We got it,
because,
David.
Okay, but make
the,
your computer comments.
yes, I was going to. For those of you who have a computer and aren't aware, I'm trying to make you aware, there's a vertical line between the gallery on your right and the presentation on the left. You can click on that line and drag it left or right to change the size of those. So if you'll drag it over to the right, about as far as you can get it, the presentation will fit on your screen a little better. Excuse me. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. Make sure I get started there. And go there.
Nauvoo Swamp, a beautiful place. By David DeBarthe and Paul DeBarthe. Historical information often gains credibility by the addition of archaeological investigations. Sometimes significant adjustment to historic accounts result from their marriage with archaeology. The authors hope to see such an adjustment to the Nauvoo Swamp tradition as a result of their investigations. Numerous historical references call Nauvoo a swamp. Joseph Smith Jr. referred to it as a beautiful place. Archaeological investigations support Joseph Smith's idea of a beautiful place more than the idea of it being a swamp. He described it to J.C. Bennett in his letter of invitation. Our principal location is at this place, Nauvoo, formerly Commerce, which is beautifully situated on the banks of the Mississippi, immediately above the lower rapids, and is probably the best and most beautiful site for a city on the river. It has a gradual ascent from the river nearly a mile, then a fine level and fertile prairie, a situation in every respect adapted to commercial and agricultural purposes, but like all other places on the river, is sickly in summer. Archaeological and geological research does not support the concept that a true swamp existed on the terrace above the Mississippi that provided the site for Nauvoo. At least it was not a wetland that existed for hundreds of years, let alone decades. There are numerous historical records of the Mormons draining the swamp. It would appear that instead of a true swamp there were scattered slow drainage areas individuals drained, and their historical record has been expanded to say that Nauvoo was located in a swamp.
That's two of them,
Consider
two of the
following.
ladies on there.
Obstacle to drainage. To be a true swamp there would need to be some geographic structure keeping the water from draining into the river. No such structure has been identified. Absence of organic material. Soil profiles show an absence of layers of organic material. Soil porosity. The soil has been shown to be quite porous, allowing water to drain out within a few days, unless blocked otherwise. Multivariate limestone permeability. Characteristics of the limestone subsurface do not support the claims regarding a swamp. Portrayal of the limestone as impermeable bypasses the multivariate evidence of outcrops on the terrace. Higher water table. The Mississippi River today is 20 feet higher than it was in the 1840s, thus, due to a higher water table we would expect the terrace to tend to be even wetter today. The water table in the Mansion House well. The Mansion House well, when excavated in 1978,
Get that stopped. Apologize. The control script thing for my voice was underneath the gallery and I couldn't get to it. So I heard Paul speak up, but I couldn't stop it. Paul, is there anything you want?
I wanted people to recognize that two of the ladies, two of the four Armstrong ladies had their pictures in that last picture of the Times and Seasons building. Well, Rebecca are bent over there, so you're looking at their side and backside, but that's two of our participants tonight with their pictures on the screen.
Showed the water table at 12 feet and the well at 28 feet deep.
Start that again.
Those measurements occur with the river.
Okay, I think I messed things up. You want me to go back farther?
Start with the higher water table.
Higher water table. The Mississippi River today is 20 feet higher than it was in the 1840s, thus, due to a higher water table we would expect the terrace to tend to be even wetter today. The water table in the Mansion House well. The Mansion House well when excavated in 1978 showed the water table at 12 feet and the well at 28 feet deep. Those measurements occur with the river level 20 feet higher than it was in the 1840s. Prehistoric occupants. Native Americans lived on the terrace and buried their dead in numerous tumuli, which indicates it was not a swamp. First Nations people occupied the site. The Sac and Fox natives had 500 lodges on the site in 1824. Pre-Mormon historic basements. At least 2 pre-Mormon European-built structures had a basement, which would not work in a swamp.
The audio cut out for
Mormon
me.
basements, Mormon structures as early
What,
I heard somebody.
Wednesday?
Wendy said her audio cut out, but I'm good. How about everybody else?
Okay, it might just be me. It's saying my internet's unstable. One moment. Thank you.
Okay, well, we want you to be able to hear it. Or you can follow along and read anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
Okay, David, yeah.
pre-Mormon historic basements. At least 2 pre-Mormon European-built structures had a basement, which would not work in a swamp. Mormon basements, Mormon structures as early as 1840 were built with basements. Disease factor, malaria, ague, passes between humans by the vector mosquitoes, therefore, it was likely the widely traveling Europeans brought in the diseases to a pristine Nauvoo, not a disease-ridden Nauvoo waiting for humans. While historical accounts of the Mormon occupation of Nauvoo perpetuate the tradition of a swamp, the above factors demonstrate the improbability of a true swamp. No obstacle to drainage. The use of the term swamp becomes a misconstruction for the city of Nauvoo because of the question of truly stagnant bodies of water. True swamps always occur in either a basin, in a wide floodplain next to a meandering river, as in a Yazoo tributary, or associated with a river oxbow. Swamps occur along the lower Mississippi where it sluggishly meanders to build oxbows, and a region of swampy land trapped by the natural river embankment built by the slow-flowing river in flood stage. This embankment prevents the water from flowing back into the river, thus forming a swamp at or below the river level. To permanently drain a swamp, you must remove the barrier that keeps the water from naturally flowing to the larger body. Nauvoo, between 2 bluffs, and on a terrace above the river next to a rapids, does not have such a barrier and precludes the formation of a swamp. There was an extremely large amount of drainage coming down from the bluff onto the terrace, raising the question of truly stagnant bodies of water. Brigham Young mired his oxen while attempting to plow the so-called swamp north of his house. The archaeologist, Paul, as a youth, mired the tractor on the Iowa farm after a heavy rain. Both the Iowa and Nauvoo areas eventually drained and dried and became usable for production. Brigham Young expedited the drainage from his swamp, but it would have drained naturally over time. It has been a very productive farmland for the last century in spite of the fact the river is 20 feet higher. The sandy loam of the flats drains water nicely. Durfee Ditch empties into the Mississippi. The efforts by the Mormons to dig ditches clearly expedited surface drainage. Channeling the runoff from the bluff by Durfee Ditch, along Highway 96, spared 2 blocks from the extra moisture. Removal of the extensive vegetation probably did as much to dry the terrace as any drainage. The Mormons superimposed a grid as a plat for the city they called Nauvoo. The streets, with the removal of the trees and undergrowth, sped up natural removal of surface water draining swampy areas. The Mormons did not remove any natural barrier between the river and the terrace that would have caused a swamp. No one has identified such a barrier to prevent the water from the flat from simply draining off into the Mississippi. Absence of organics. Swamps stagnate enough that organic material builds up over ages. Archaeological investigations at Nauvoo have shown no layered humus one expects to find deposited by a swamp. The upper portion of the soil profiles have been mixed by plowing and gardening from the city of Nauvoo over the last nearly 200 years. It is rare, if at all possible, to find a profile where the plow zone portion is undisturbed anywhere on the flats. In addition, years of erosion carrying sediments from the bluff out over the flats changes the upper portion of the profile, particularly on the northern and eastern part of the flats. Even if an undisturbed profile could be found, an undisturbed swamp deposit would have been laid down over many ages, reaching well below the plow zone, 20 plus centimeters, which is limited to the top foot. A geologically newly created swamp on the terrace overlooking rapids may fit the swamp tradition, but it does not fit the geology. Soil profiles were examined on the following sites: Turley, Samuel Smith, in picture, Joseph Smith Sr., the homestead, and on the Times and Seasons as well as the mansion house. In each of these cases, there was not enough organic black material to indicate a true swamp. From the surface to 1 foot, 30 centimeters, below the surface, the profiles had a dark sandy loam, then lighter colored sandy loam 1 to 2 feet, 30 centimeters to 60 centimeters, below the surface, and then gravel and limestone outliers. In a true swamp there should be significant layers of organic material. Geologically, peat and coal come from swamps. In their Figure 12, the engineers who wrote Transforming Swampland into Nauvoo, the City Beautiful, A Civil Engineering Perspective, BYU Studies Quarterly, Volume 45, Issue 3, Article 6, in 2006, gave an excellent profile showing that there was a large amount of soil right next to the foot of the bluff. For them, the presence of dark clay material gave evidence of the swamp. The depth of soil narrowed toward the river. Thus, it is apparent that what they're seeing is erosion deposit from 200 years of topsoil from farms above the bluff. Clay is not consistent with a swamp. It is possible that the northern part of the terrace has more clay because of this erosion. To justify a swamp, layers of humus vegetation, not clay, remaining from pooled water should be found below the plow zone. It is not found where archaeologists have tested. Instead, below the sandy loam, a layer of gravel and then the limestone outliers are found. Note, we are awaiting permission to use the engineer's figures before publication of this article. Soil porosity.
Okay, I didn't get it stopped quite where I wanted to, but that's close enough. I'm going to try to expand this up about, let's see, yeah, 328, that may be good enough. Let's see. Move it over. Scroll it up.
You got it.
Okay, here's their Figure 12. East-west cross-section through Nauvoo between Munson and Hotchkiss streets, showing the ground surface, groundwater location, and underlying bedrock. So let me talk about their diagram. I think it's an excellent diagram. They've done an excellent job, but I want to talk about it a little bit. They augered with a 3-inch auger test holes to look at the soil profile. They found in this area particularly a dark clay material, which caused them to conclude that that was swamp material. They assumed that the limestone was impervious. That is, water did not go down through the limestone, it stayed up on top. The brick layout you see is a standard layout, standard way geologists use to show limestone, but does not represent what limestone actually looks like, and you'll see that later. But don't get fooled by the bricks. They're not, limestone is not in bricks like that. It comes in a very different form. They show the Durfee ditch where they drained the water. Notice it's right up here, and they drained the water off to protect this area from groundwater. And we'll tell you more about the Durfee ditch a little later. But I wanted you to see the Durfee ditch here because that's important in showing their groundwater line, which they show as a dashed line, starting down here and staying right at the surface all the way up until Durfee ditch drops it down. So they're showing that Durfee ditch dropped the groundwater, therefore that would reduce the swampiness. The groundwater table has to be right at the surface if you're going to have a swamp. This is a calculated groundwater line, however. It is not, there's nothing that they've done to prove that that's where the line would be. If I was going to do a groundwater line, I would start at the river and I would draw it pretty parallel. Right across, coming here. Unfortunately, we haven't had time to do and may not ever do wells up here on the prairie. Wonder what the groundwater table would be up there. And the best way to find a groundwater table is to drill a well and see what the groundwater table is. We don't know how that would go, but I think we have proof that it would be at river level, not at surface level. And I want you to note that there is no barrier here, which is a very accurate drawing. There is no barrier to keep the water from simply running down off the flat into the river. Now, I say running, that's implies too much. Let's say seeping anyway. But for the water to be stagnant is a little kind of a stretch as far as we're concerned. Okay, I'm going to try now to get back to...
Just a moment, David, the water level for the Mississippi.
Pardon?
They have the water level for the Mississippi for where it was then. Now it is 20 feet higher.
Yeah. Today the water level is up here, 20 feet higher. See, here's 20 feet. The river level has come up 20 feet and the land is not swampy.
Well, but you will see the Captain James White House surrounded by water because it was built 20 feet above the water, but now it's submerged.
Okay. Where'd it go? Oh, I lost
Amazing.
That's close enough. Now let's see. And we gotta need to move that back over. Okay, that should be back about where we were.
Looks good.
Soil porosity, heavy rainfalls do occur in Nauvoo. Excavated basements, those which have been left exposed, have collected water after heavy rain. However, they have drained out within 1 to 3 days. The Smith stable on the south side of Water Street, excavated by Robert T. Bray in 1970, did not have a basement but holds water after heavy rain and illustrates the reasonably prompt drainage. On August 4 and 5, 2023, the Nauvoo pageant provided a compelling example. A small shower on the first night did not stop the enjoyment of the large crowd at the production but afterward, became a 7.8-inch cloudburst. 20 hours after the storm, another large crowd of participants, parked on the same 2 blocks of grass utilized the night before, and no one sank into the swamp, mud, or got stuck. The archaeologist, Paul DeBarthe, had the privilege of escorting Mary, Rebecca, and Rebecca, yes, 3 Rebeccas in the same family, in Mormon period gowns with hems close to the ground, to the Saturday evening pageant. Their hems did not get wet. Trucks and cars parked, as was done on the grass in the same areas the night before. They did not get stuck in the swamp. The Durfee Ditch did carry a rush of water to the river all day. That was substantially to the south of the pageant site. There have been efforts to facilitate drainage in Nauvoo and they have expedited removal of the temporary surface water. However, the 7-plus-inch rainfall absorbed in 20 hours defies the repeated mythology of the swamp. The thousands of years of the terrace serving people as homeland in this beautiful place could serve as a more accurate replacement for the swamp myth. The music from the pageant was delightful. The irony of being repeatedly instructed about the swamp while sitting high and dry where the swamp was supposed to be, shortly after a deluge, stimulated this article. Varied limestone outcrops. The Mississippian aged limestone is known for its layers, fissures, massive formations, and caves. the limestone portrayed by the civil engineers appears like brick. While this is the geological standard for depicting limestone, limestone occurs with cracks and significant gaps. Nobody knows what is really under the surface. This brick-like portrayal may mislead the reader. When Robert T. Bray of the University of Missouri at Columbia conducted his tests on Block 149 in 1975, he found with the trencher that a great deal of irregularity appeared. The trencher would dig down to 3 and 4 feet deep and then bounce up to 2 feet when it hit the limestone outliers. There are areas today where in the spring, water is retained enough that mowing is not possible. By late in May, the natural drainage through these porous soils permits both mowing and archaeological excavations. Irregularity of the limestone subsurface could easily produce spots that don't drain as rapidly as other locations, making them appear swampy. Water table issues. The water table, to a large extent, would be regulated by the level of the Mississippi River. The civil engineers calculated the water table at the ground surface, supporting their thesis of a swamp. When in 1841, the Nauvoo house construction began at the edge of the terrace, the water level of the Mississippi was 20 feet below it. The historical record shows that Joseph and Hiram Smith were buried in the basement of the Nauvoo house in 1844. The Nauvoo house modified by Major Bidamon the 1870s has only a crawl space. Because of the dam at Keokuk raising the river level 20 feet, the Nauvoo house currently suffers from every flood of the Mississippi in spite of the artificial embankment. Picture shows pumping water from crawl space. Only a couple of feet difference exists between the level of the river and the floor of the Nauvoo house. The crawl space remains wet because the water table closely matches the river level. The water table in the Mansion House well. When in 1978, the archaeologists cleared the Mansion House well, surface about 10 feet above the floor level of the Nauvoo house. See the drop in the 1907 Anderson picture from the Mansion House to the Nauvoo house. They encountered the water table at 12 feet. It took 2 pumps since a single pump was not sufficient to keep up with the inflow of water. Again, the river level was 20 feet lower when Joseph Smith had the well dug. The archaeologist had to pump out the water in order to clean down to the 28-foot depth of the original construction. That depth of the well probably most accurately marks the water table of 1843 to 44. Interestingly, Joseph Smith paid $28 for digging a 28-foot deep well. Typically, the well diggers would stop digging a few feet below hitting water. The proprietor, at a good day's wage per foot, did not want to pay for digging far beyond the water level. Therefore, the archaeologist concludes that the water table level, in 1843 to 44, could not have been at the surface of the flat, which is essential for a true swamp, but was closer to river level, 20 feet lower. Alma Blair at the Mansion House well.
Okay, so here's Alma. Those of you who've been involved in any Mormon history kind of things have undoubtedly run into Alma Blair. He's no longer with us, but we miss him very much. He spent many, many years teaching at Graceland University and many years at Nauvoo, running internships and teaching classes and giving tours. A marvelous guy. I was fortunate enough that Al and I were golfing partners for about 10 years before his health reached a point he could no longer go golfing. But I miss the guy. He was a wonderful, wonderful person. These 2 gentlemen we assume are visitors. We have no idea who they are. Paul, this child.
Jared Fears, I believe. That's
Okay.
Floyd Fears' son. Floyd was the ground manager for the site at the time.
And the well is over here. They were pumping water out of it at the time.
There was a well started at the homestead site during the Hugh White occupation. Because of the greatly increased population and the greater need for water, it was expanded during Smith's occupation to approximately the same depth, 32 feet. The well expanders were required to dynamite limestone to reach a good pool of water when expanding this well. This demonstrated that good water existed within the limestone strata. The Durfee ditch would not have had an impact on the water table at these well sites. A natural ditch intervened. Prehistoric occupants. When Joseph Smith named the terrace that began 20 feet above the Mississippi River and associated highlands, Nauvoo, the beautiful city, he may not have recognized the area had been seen by mankind as a beautiful homeland for thousands of years. On the homestead site in which numerous Mormon artifacts were uncovered, below them in situ were found diagnostic artifacts of the prehistoric occupants. Archaeological investigations at Nauvoo support the site as a beautiful place of residence for more than 5,000 years. The local Burlington Chert projectile point evidence of mammoth hunters 10,000 years ago clearly demonstrates they were on the site. However, the question of whether they resided here remains open. With the archaic bison hunters, roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, residence becomes more evident. The numerous lanceolate projectile points created by the residents at the bend in the river now known as Nauvoo signified it a beautiful place for these intrepid hunters. Not only the points but places where lithic technicians produced them from the local Burlington Chert have been uncovered on the terrace. With the head of the Des Moines Rapids providing a shallow zone for crossing the Mississippi River, especially in low water seasons, bison crossing either way could be met by hunters awaiting them on the eastern bank. Thousands of years of prehistoric residents of the terrace above the river, living harmoniously in their environment, utilized the local resources. The archaeologist who mapped the chert debris on the homestead site found a pattern of debitage that matched his cross-legged knees-bent sitting pattern. After mapping chert flakes and chips, he realized he was sitting in the same place and posture where a native lithic craftsman about 5,000 years ago had sat creating a lanceolate projectile point found nearby. The striations on the projectile point matched those on the chert chips and flakes. The archaeologist admired both the similarity of positions of the napper and the mapper and the beautiful sunset over the river. The prospect that his predecessor sitting in the same place facing west shared a sunset experience reflected in the water bound the two across millennia. Neither was sitting in a swamp. By 2,500 years ago, early woodland pottery makers settled on the terrace overlooking the river. Their ceramics, projectile points, awls, scrapers, and their burials attest to a people living on this beautiful bend in the river. Local clays probably were used by these people, and we know they were used by the Mormons both for bricks and pottery. Middle woodland mound builders followed, about 2,000 years ago, leaving clear evidence of 1,000 miles of trade goods revealed in a burial ossuary near the Red Brick Store. Dongola Chert from Tennessee, Antler Tools, a dozen oval bifaces, and Catlinite from Minnesota, bottom picture, demonstrate the presence of trade goods. They could use the local Burlington chert and vessels made from local clay in exchange for distant trade goods. The location of the terrace at the head of the rapids would make this an important resting point for travelers transiting up and down the Mississippi. The local resources made it an excellent place for these remarkable residents of the terrace, that later became Nauvoo, to host these travelers. Prehistoric burials. On the Smith Homestead block, 2 aboriginal burial sites, possibly of the same extended family, have been uncovered. The early woodland site, found in 1976, predated the modern era by 2,500 to 2,200 years. West and a little north of the Smith Cemetery, their burial ossuary, dug to a depth of 5 feet, had been covered with logs and limestone. A middle woodland burial, 2,000 to 1,500 BP, found in 1979, a few feet east of the Red Brick Store, not as deep, but was still a burial ossuary in what would not have been a swamp. The revolutionary development of pottery indicates a sedentary lifestyle. The grit-tempered cord-marked pottery of the early woodland evolved into the pottery of the middle woodland. This supports the idea of continuity in the habitation of the terrace. It is interesting to see that both prehistoric and the Mormon people lived on and used the southern edge of the terrace for burying their loved ones, not a logical case if it was a swamp. The Gustavus Hills map published by the Times and Seasons, 1846, shows numerous ancient tumuli, burial mounds, on the terrace. Unfortunately, mounds identified as tumuli often were excavated to pirate tombs within. As often, they have been bulldozed for modern development. Because no scientific excavation was done on any of the tumuli, it is not possible today to know for sure which of the prehistoric periods they represented. Tumuli in the general area have been excavated and dated from 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. Also, mounds and tombs have been found on the bluffs and on the terraces, but not in swamps. At 20 feet above the river, the terrace was not very susceptible to flooding. Who would bury their loved ones in a wetland, especially with the bluff right there? With the bluffs available, the woodland people still chose to bury on the terrace. They would not have interred their loved ones in a swamp. Again, the beautiful bend in the river became the domicile for these villagers who lived here, knapped lithic tools here, made pottery here, decorated their clothing with beads, constructed mounds here, and buried their dead on this terrace. First Nations people occupied the site. Captain James White is credited with purchasing access to the east side of the river, now Nauvoo, in 1824, from the Sac and Fox for 2,000 bushels of corn. The village of about 500 lodges, named for its leader, Quashkima, peaceful place, moved to the west side of the river where they gained the benefit of the orchard planted by Honoré. This shows that the Nauvoo Terrace was populated by First Nations people within 2 decades of when the Mormons moved in. James White built a stone house at the head of the rapids in 1824 to 1829. At the time the swamp supposedly existed, this house was built on the edge of the terrace 20 feet above the river level. Today its foundation north of Parley Street is submerged during flood stage at the edge of the river. Pictures of the White House are from the Marvin Crozier collection.
And as Paul mentioned, here's a picture of the White House from the Crozier collection showing a flood. Today, there's only a few stones of foundation that we have identified. We know where it is because we've seen foundation stones, but the buildings no longer exist.
Go to the upper picture, David.
White's son Hugh, whose log house was later occupied.
Sorry, Paul.
I wanted you to go to the upper one. Just to highlight that if you're standing on the porch on the west side of that house, you would have among the most marvelous views of sunset available anywhere in the Midwest. And I just wanted to call to attention that Captain James White chose a very beautiful location right at the head of the rapids and right where he could see the sunsets across the river.
White's son Hugh, whose log house was later occupied by Joseph Smith and his family, appears to have been responsible for a pre-Mormon well and for the basement under the beehouse. Picture is of the remains of the beehouse. Early historic occupants built basements. Late woodland evidences show continued occupation of the site until the historic period when the Sac and Fox appear to have displaced the Illiwick. Population pressure from the invading Europeans converged here. French traders came in from the north and encountered the Spanish from the south. Americans pushed from the east and all met at least figuratively on our bend in the river. In 1799 the Spanish lieutenant governor of Upper Louisiana, Zenon Trudeau, provided a land grant at the head of the Des Moines Rapids to Louis Tesson Honoré. Honoré, a Frenchman, fought with the Spanish against the British at the Battle of St. Louis in 1780 to earn the land grant. He built a log house at the head of the rapids, but its exact location is lost. He established an orchard on the west side of the river. William Ewing, appointed by the U.S. government, is recorded to have established his effort to teach agriculture to the Indians on what became the Nauvoo bend of the river in 1805. This curious effort by the U.S. government, coordinated by the French furred trading Choteau family in St. Louis, placed an agent, Ewing, on the site who knew less about agriculture than did the natives he was to teach. Zebulon Pike, in his traverse of the site, found Ewing to be incompetent. In 1807 Ewing was replaced by Nicholas Boylevin, under whose supervision the post was closed. Dennis Julian established a trading post from 1805 to 1819. He married a First Nations, Iowa woman, giving him access to the fur trade with her tribe. He is recorded to have established a trading post downriver from Ewing. Picture is a fragment of a French wine bottle found at the homestead site. Julian and Honoré worked together, Honoré translating for Ewing, and Julian becoming the prevailing contact with the natives for the next decade and a half. He employed other fur traders, Frenchmen married to native women, to work for him and raised his family on the east bank of the river near the head of the rapids. In other words, the beautiful bend in the river with a bluff overlooking, proved a good home for the Julian family. Archaeological evidence at the basement site of Water and Bain Streets does not support the idea it was a residence or barn or root cellar. The basement had partially deteriorated, requiring refurbishing by the time the Mormons established the Times and Seasons building over it in 1839. Since it had deteriorated, it must have been at least one generation older. The archaeological record has now shown that the pre-Mormon basement was a storage facility, probably for furs. View of northeast corner of Times and Seasons basement with student pointing to granite intrusion 4 courses from floor. The vertical line on the right marks the south edge of the original entry with steps to the east. The granite insert aligns with the center of the builder's trench.
That's a Ron Edwards photo.
Okay, so here's the south edge of the entryway. This is where the stairwell was. This picture back here shows the Mormons closed that in and they rebuilt this whole northeast corner, which apparently had crumbled down considerably, probably weakened because there was a stairwell that close to it. So you can't see the stairwell very well here. Paul has lots of pictures of the stairwell, but there wasn't room to put those in here and still have the verbiage. So there's it mentions the builder's trench, which is here. We're going to show you next a picture taken from the west, looking east along that builder's trench.
The vertical line?
Vertical line is the south edge of the stairwell.
And the significance of the granite stone?
Go ahead.
Notice the Mormon period materials the pre-Mormon materials are the limestone that has been pulled directly from the outliers. So it's rounded generally. And only when we get to the Mormon period, we find the intrusion of stone and brick. And we have granite and schist as well, big chunks up on the top. But here's a chunk of granite down 4 courses from the bottom to give another indication that that portion of the building had been rebuilt by the Mormons.
The builder's trench at the northeast corner of the basement. Note the white and reddish spots, limestone and brick fragments from backfill, exposed in the soil of the area east of the shovel. The arrow points north. Undisturbed soil west of the shovel has no brick bats and limestone fragments. Close-up of the west wall showing natural stone used by original builder as opposed to quarried stone used by Mormon builders.
Okay, so here's the west wall, which stayed up, didn't fall down. As Paul mentioned, then this is natural stone, not quarried stone. Up here on top, there are quarried stones, showing that the Mormons, when they put the Times and Seasons on, built a little bit on top of the foundation that was already there. But this evidence then if that was a pre-Mormon structure.
Mortar free.
Pardon?
Free of mortar. There's dry.
Oh, yes. So there's no mortar holding those rocks together. That's true of both the pre-Mormon and the Mormon of that age. So the lack of mortar doesn't prove it was pre-Mormon, but certainly the stones would indicate that that was not quarry cut Mormon stone.
Dennis Julian, the longest-serving non-First Nations person prior to the Mormons, would appear most likely to have dug the basement on the terrace. To have built a basement in a swamp would have been unlikely. For him or possibly another trader to have dug through the limestone outliers and used them in the dry wall construction was the action of someone of permanence. No transient would have done that hard work. No one would have done it in a swamp where the basement would continuously be flooded. The homestead block had 4 basements, one under the keeping room added in 1840, one under the log schoolhouse mentioned in Joseph Smith III memoirs, one under the bee house under which Joseph and Hiram were buried from 1844 to 1928, and one under the red brick store opened in January, 1841, pictured. Joseph III indicates the one under the log schoolhouse had previously, pre-Mormon, been used for vegetable storage. Joseph Smith III indicates that a small log building between their house and the river had a basement which would have been pre-existing to the Mormons. The Hugh White homestead prior to the Mormon development would have been responsible for this basement. There is some confusion about what buildings Joseph Smith III was referring to, but at least one of them appears to have had a pre-Mormon basement. The supporting evidence for a swamp in Nauvoo gathered by civil engineers in Figure 6 shows swampy areas.
Okay, I don't need to expand this. I think you can see it. Location of the swampy crosshatched areas as indicated by historical accounts overlaid on the plat by Gustavus Hill. So this shows, you can get a feeling for how much of the swamp, the historical record, I'm sorry, how much of the Nauvoo, the historical records really say are swampy. So here are, they obviously went to a lot of work to dig out the historical accounts and then plot those on this Gustavus Hill plat to show where the swamps were. And you can see percentage-wise for Nauvoo, even the civil engineers who were there to prove the wonderful swamp stories came up with very small areas that were actual swamp.
Oh, those are significant because notice the big area is precisely where the main street business.
Hold on, Paul.
Obviously, a lot of effort has been made to research historical documents to determine exactly what part of the terrace was swampy. It is apparent that in the historical accounts, the swampy portions were relatively small compared to the rest of the terrace. In any relatively flat area with large amounts of snowmelt and rainfall, there will be standing water for a period of time. Large amounts of vegetation would naturally slow down the drainage of the area. That hardly justifies calling Joseph's beautiful place a swamp. It was interesting that the Mormons created their business district in the largest swampy area of the terrace. In the figure, 2 blocks to the east and a little north of the north end of the largest swampy area, one can see the largest tumuli left by the Native Americans. The Homestead Block, 155, where Joseph Smith first resided, is located south of the main swampy areas that the civil engineers note and west of the swampy area on Block 146. There is natural drainage between Block 146 and the Homestead Block. The Nauvoo house opposite the Joseph Smith residences, on Block 156, is lower than the swampy area by 10 feet or more. This offers counterpoint to the claim of the swamp. The Levi Hancock house marks the southernmost edge of the engineer's swampy area. The swamp is immediately to the west and north. This is the 2-block area spared from runoff by the Durfee ditch dug by the Mormons, so perhaps the ditch reduced the standing water enough that Hancock and Brinkerhoff could build basements. The Community of Christ Visitors Center occupies the center of that swampy area. Natural drainage through the ditch between blocks 147 and 146 can be seen in the Gustavus Hills map, making it difficult to perceive a swamp on that block.
Okay, so here's the same picture I showed you above, same drawing. We can make any number of comments here. Paul, you want to say more about the business district?
Well, the simple fact that they're putting the biggest swamp right where the reconstruction of the Times and Seasons, where the reconstruction of the Jonathan Browning, the tin shop, and so forth, that whole series is embedded in the swamp area. That's rather significant because it was under construction by 1840 and clearly most of it completed by 1842.
Okay. The Durfee ditch that you've heard mentioned several times, we think that pretty sure this is Durfee Street right here, which today is roughly the highway. And it goes up to about there, as I remember. So there's the Durfee ditch. Paul mentioned we mentioned the 2 blocks that are protected by the Durfee ditch. You can see the natural stream came down here. I think from growing up on the farm, we would have called that a swale, where the ditch has a wider flat spot that tends to stay wet longer and doesn't drain down as fast as the rest does. To call it a swamp, okay. But you can see the Durfee ditch was not, well, I think it was intended to protect a little bit Brigham Young's house because water coming down, but the natural drainage, I think, would have protected that. So this swampy area west and a little bit north of Brigham Young's house was a swampy area, but it is like the others. Let's see.
Commerce.
Hang on, I've got my notes, but my light isn't bright enough to see them. Got
Okay.
to read carefully. Oh, Brigham Young's. Yeah, I mentioned Brigham Young's house. We mentioned the visitor center here, the Community of Christ Visitor Center. The LDS Visitor Center is right there. Notice that's where the tumuli was. So, for whatever that's worth, the wells that we talked about, let's see, Joseph Smith's properties. So the well on the at the mansion house would have been about there. You can see where it is compared to the swamp. And we mentioned that the Durfee ditch would not have protected that. You can see that there's natural drainage, which means that's lower natural drainage between there and the well that was there. And then, of course, the Homestead well would be across over here on this block. The town of Commerce would have been about here, where this swampy area is. So again, a low spot that was wet major part of the time, but still the city was being built there. Anything you want to add, Paul?
I think you've got that commerce plot coming up so people can see that that will overlap.
Yes, you can see it, but you need to note this swampy area with respect to the commerce map that we'll show you a little later.
And Venus and Commerce got started in 1834. So, yeah, pre-Mormon. Pre-Mormons found that it was habitable.
Mormon basements, on the mansion house block, a basement under the north wing of the mansion, 2 under the mansion house hotel wing, pictured, 1 at the Hiram Clark house, and 1 on the Samuel H. Smith property all defy a swamp. It has not yet been excavated, but a plausible basement under the Theodore Turley brick house and or brewery on the southeast corner of the lot could be added to the list. This one was located in a low spot, near the natural drainage from the bluff. These 9 or 10 Mormon period basements also challenge the swamp tradition. Under what circumstances can a basement in a swamp be justified? Disease factor: mosquitoes were undoubtedly a problem. There would have been plenty of places below the terrace on the edge of the river and on its islands for them to breed, so the presence of mosquitoes does not give evidence for a swamp. Malaria, ague, passes between humans by the vector mosquitoes, therefore, it was probable the widely traveling European humans brought in the diseases to the beautiful bend in the river, not a disease-ridden swamp waited for humans. Historical background. Landowners, Alexander White and Joseph Tease, established a post office at Venus, which by 1834 was renamed into Commerce. There, 24 lots of the 144 lots fronted on the river, conveniencing warehousing and keel boating above the rapids. On paper, in 1837, Commerce City added 376 lots at $250 each to the north of Commerce. None of these were sold during the Panic of 1837. These urban plans were laid because of wonderful prospects, not because it was a swamp. The use of the term swamps in Nauvoo was evident in the November 1, 1841 action of the City Council. It was unanimously adopted that the swamp directly west of Councillor Brigham Young's house be drained, so soon as circumstances permit. Today, there is no evidence that such action was ever taken and the area would have drained naturally given time. The term swamp was, and still is, used and misused by anyone who has an area that stays wet longer than the rest of the property. Pseudo-swamp may be a more appropriate term.
Paul, you'll have to clarify it for me, but as I remember, the Durfee ditch was dug, the city council said, let's drain Brigham Young's swamp, and so they dug the Durfee ditch.
I think the Durfee ditch actually got ahead of that.
You think the Durfee ditch was ahead of Brigham Young's swamp?
Yes,
okay.
I think Durfee ditch came 1840. And so this was 1841 that Brigham Young got his oxen stuck, and so he was complaining they needed to help him out.
Richard Lyman Bushman says, water seeping out of the bluffs along the eastern edge of Marshy Peninsula required the Saints dig a drainage canal, and even then the land was too wet to permit cellars. Evidence of at least one pre-Mormon basement on the homestead site, the Times and Seasons pre-Mormon basement plus numerous Mormon, at least 10 basements now known, speak to the contrary of no cellars. In addition, no archaeology has been done on the Venus and Commerce sites. Benjamin E. Park in Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, 2020:22, says, though the region was known for its beauty, its environment was difficult to tame. The Saints later recalled it as a wilderness. The standing water in the flats required them to construct a drainage ditch to remove the spring's runoff water. The work became more urgent after an outbreak of malaria that first summer, due to the swampy conditions, that resulted in several deaths. But the water eventually receded, and a new city began to grow. Note that the water is coming from the bluff and not part of a swamp. Malarial mosquitoes can easily be bred on the lowlands by the river and its islands, not in the flat. We credit the historian with a more accurate statement here in the fact that the water receded, and the city was able to grow. With the city plats and the layout of streets with curbs, drainage naturally occurred, accommodating the city growth. Smith's beautiful site for a city on the river observation that it was sickly in the summer acknowledged a problem people attributed to the location. Many of the Mormons settling there referred to the swamp they drained to make the place their home, establishing a myth so often repeated that it has become standard litany for historians, for presentations to tourists at the LDS Visitor Center, and in the pageants. The use of the term swamp for Nauvoo is an exaggeration magnified by historical repetition. Even such notables as Mark Scherer in his The Journey of a People perpetuated the myth. Only in Smith's imagination could this land be called beautiful, since it was a stagnant water swampland with a few abandoned structures. However, the stagnant water swamp cannot be supported archaeologically nor geologically. Summary: pseudo-swamp. Thousands of years of occupation on the Mississippi River bend, that became Nauvoo, verifies its designation as a beautiful site. The claim for it being a swamp is another matter. Archaeological investigations, prehistoric, pre-Mormon historic and of the Mormon period, all raise questions about the characterization of the landform as a swamp. The tradition of the Nauvoo Swamp rests upon misunderstandings, misinformation, and a great deal of repetition. Swamps form when water cannot flow into or back into the slow-moving river because of some impediment. The Nauvoo Terrace is next to the Des Moines Rapids, and there is no impediment to prevent water from flowing into the river. A terrace 20 feet above a river rapids does not geologically match a landform for a swamp. The humus layers expected in a swamp were not found on the terrace at Nauvoo. The fact that prehistoric peoples had buried their dead in tumuli and in ossuaries on the terrace above the river demonstrates 2 millennia of pre-Mormon confidence that burials here were placed where they could be remembered and revisited, not in a swamp. Prior to the Mormons occupying the terrace above the river, natives lived there. In 1820, just 20 years before the Mormons, there were about 500 Sac and Fox native lodges. No, that's not a misprint, 500 as recorded in the history of Nauvoo, Illinois in Wikipedia, in a village on the east side of the river. Yet, historians claim it was a disease-infected swamp. Pre-Mormon Europeans dug a basement for storage, later used for supporting the Second Times and Seasons building at Bain and Water Streets. This basement structure affirms a habitable terrace, not a swamp. Basements dug on the terrace by Mormons defy the claim of a swamp. Spring seasons in Nauvoo tend to be wet. Drainage in 1839 was not fast enough to suit the Mormons. The vegetation held rainwater and snow melt. They removed trees and shrubs and dug drainage ditches, reducing the swampiness of the site. Mormons then proceeded to dig basements for their houses and root cellars on the terrace. The temporary swampy condition on isolated areas drained, dried and became indistinguishable from the rest of the terrace. No actual swamp has been demonstrated. The idea of the Nauvoo Swamp adjacent to and on a terrace above the Des Moines Rapids is not geologically sound. Therefore, as a matter of accuracy in geology, in archaeology, and in tradition, the case for a swamp fits the pattern of mythology better than the pattern for a swamp. Let the swamp in Nauvoo be drained from Mormon history. Last revision October 30, 2023.
Okay. Have at it.
The floor is open for your comments and questions.
Paul doesn't get the first one this time.
Well, I could go to the appendix, but well, you got Terry wanting to get a first question in, so and I think Deb is here to monitor who's in line. But Terry, go ahead.
A question about where the Joseph Smith's, the Red Brick Store and Hiram Store were on the edge of what is the lake, sort of a swampy area now. Supposedly, there was a pier going out from Hiram's house to the water. How does that fit in with the water, the river level being 20 feet lower than it is today?
I don't think there was a pier from Hiram's house. It may have been from Hiram's barn, because Hiram's barn was down closer to the river where they could hoist things up the 10 feet or so to put it at the Water Street level where the store was. But there was they were building a dam to be able to provide regular water for the industries of Nauvoo, and that dam was a major project that at least got started, and it would have been coming in just about where Hiram's barn was.
It was the barn much lower than the store, where the store is now.
The barn foundation is still in sight. The barn foundation is at the level of the river.
Okay.
So when the river floods, that barn foundation gets wet also.
Right.
The Red Brick Store would be about there. Hiram's house would have been about there. The barn out here, well, on this picture, the barn down in here somewhere. And if you stand at that site today, you can see, there's a pretty good drop down to the river, but the river's right there today. If you let the river be another 20 feet lower, there was room for the barn below the edge of that.
Okay.
The Times and Seasons building is right there.
Right. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Paul?
Certainly.
How did you calculate the 20 feet?
That is calculated, well, it's actually 22 feet that the water level has risen since the dam was put in at Keokuk in 1913.
Yeah, but how'd you calculate it? How'd you come up with that number?
That's the number that W.O. Hands used when he was investigating in 1928, because the engineers had promised the water level would come up 20 feet. And so the church, this was the church at that time, was concerned that the water level was actually coming up higher than what they calculated. So they ended up rushing W.O. Hands in there to look for the bodies, because they were concerned that the river might, the rising river, the lake might very well cover the bodies. But that's the 20 foot. I rounded that to 20 feet. It's actually a 22-foot rise from the river.
Okay.
And actually, you see, we didn't calculate it. We used historical records.
Yeah. So you quoted the reference to that historical record.
Yes, there were footnotes there, but when the when the Word document gets to that point, it quits reading.
Okay. Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Thank you. You see, we're going to have a tough time squeezing it into a half hour.
We'll work on
it. Maybe you found your third presentation now, huh?
Yeah. Well, I got two. I'm just thrilled that you said yes.
Well, you can see that this one actually, as presented tonight, actually took just about an hour.
Yeah, I wrote the time down.
Okay, so there's a problem in how we can cut that back if we have to.
Yeah, we'll work on it.
If you've got the extra slot, then David has agreed to either make the trip or be available on Zoom.
All right, we'll work on it. I'll call you tomorrow and we'll work on
Okay, fair enough.
We timed it before at 34 minutes, but that was before we added our comment, stopping and putting in our comments.
it.
So we could present it without our comments, I suppose, and get pretty close to your half-hour time.
Well, actually, yeah, we had 34 minutes. We've done some adding since then. So probably 40 minutes or so. All right, if there's no other questions, I'm going to go to the appendix. If I can find it. Okay, do I get the appendix in front of you?
Yes.
All right. I wanted to highlight that this Nauvoo Swamp stuff came up because we've been working on the Times and Seasons, and this is Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, and so I wanted to show the relationship of our project to the Book of Mormon. The fact is that the Times and Seasons building is where the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon was published, at least part of it. And there's a fascinating story. Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith had started publishing the Times and Seasons in the first Times and Seasons building, which would probably, I think it was in a warehouse in Commerce. Anyway, it was north, and it was close to the river enough that the riverside of the warehouse leaked. It leaked badly enough that they got their papers wet. They got sick, and Don Carlos and his family were sick for 10 months. In that meantime, they proceeded to build a sort of a shabby small building downtown or near town, which proves to be this one. And in early May of 1840, Ebenezer was living in a log house 1 block west, and he walked to the Times and Seasons, just finally beginning to recover from his 8 months of illness. And as he walked to the Times and Seasons, he was hit with what he called a ball of fire that settled down through his head and settled in his bones. And with fire in his bones, he finished his hike to the Times and Seasons, talked with Don Carlos, and said, look, the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. Those copies are all gone. We republished it in 1837, and I helped set the type at Kirtland, and those copies are all gone. We really need to get more copies of the Book of Mormon available. Don Carlos agreed. Joseph Smith came in. Joseph Smith agreed to work on helping to get the editorial adjustments made. And then they both agreed to raise $200 apiece so that they could get the new Book of Mormon published. Well, Don Carlos and Ebenezer raised $140, maybe just a little bit more than that. Joseph Smith didn't raise any, but nonetheless, 1 month later, this would have been June of 1840, Ebenezer bravely got on a boat, went down to Cincinnati, where he had heard that there was places that you could get the book published again. And walking into a city where he didn't know anyone, he still had the fire in his bones enough to start going and knocking on doors and asking for help. And he got turned down. And he finally got to an alley where there was a printing office by Mr. Gleason and Shepherd. And when he walked in, Mr. Shepherd, he explained what he was about, and Mr. Shepherd said, I want to do that book. And here he had it in his pocket, the edited copy, pulled it out of his pocket, and Mr. Shepherd says, I want to do that book. And Mr. Shepherd then arranged to go with him to the paper supplier. Don Carlos, by this time, had spent $50 on paper to send back to Ebenezer, sent $50 worth of paper back to Don Carlos so that he could publish the Times and Seasons and let people know the Book of Mormon was going to be available by the end of the summer at $1 per copy. So here's a matter of fire in their bones, courage to say, we can do this thing, we're going to. And they put their lives on the line and their income. Mr. Shepherd wanted $100 down for doing the stereotyping. And so I think that left $4 for Don Carlos to get housing and food for the next month or so. And he did. He also got hired to read proof, and so he got a little bit of income that way. But Mr. Shepherd took him to get the paper, and the paper supplier agreed to defer, to give him the paper and get paid 3 months later. The binder made the same agreement because of Mr. Shepherd's being well known to them. And then Mr. Shepherd pointed out I don't know you, Mr. Robinson. You have no letters of reference, and yet somehow I am I have this strong feeling that I should do this book. Well, that's the case. I've been inspired to offer my pledge, and you got it. Well, Don Carlos set out in the Times and Seasons that the book was coming. People began sending in money for it, and by the time August arrived, they had the Book of Mormon 1,000 copies ready, and they were able to send those out to the people that had already ordered them. They had took another 1,000 copies back to Nauvoo with them. Joseph Smith had authorized 4,000 copies, and so it was a fascinating issue to me to discover that Ebenezer was able to buy the stereotype equipment, the foundry equipment, and we have found evidence of that. We found fragments of the kettle that probably was used, and some isinglass that would have been in the door of the stove. And then, of course, we have found over 600 pieces of type. The fact that, and also some lead that hadn't been melted down yet. So here's all these little bits of evidence to show that that the Book of Mormon was actually being published here. Now, that was only a comparatively brief time. We find that the type, there's over 600 pieces of type that we have found on the site, predominantly the 4-point ruby, which was used in the Book of Mormon, but then a good deal of the 6-point bourgeois, which was used in the Times and Seasons, except that Times and Seasons also used the ruby for poems. And so you can see that difference in the script when you're looking at the Times and Seasons. And there's a few other varieties as well, but those are the two dominant types of type that were found there. So they had, that is, Smith and Robinson had bought type from Mr. Galland when they came to Nauvoo, and he had to have gotten his from Cincinnati, because the first types, the first printer in St. Louis didn't get started until 1840, and so it was 1839 when they got the type from Galland, and so he must have got it from Cincinnati, and so that type matched what they bought in Cincinnati. Now, to me, one of the more fascinating additional artifacts is this one, found at the north side of the Times and Seasons structure. Here is a medallion that that shows Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Got a log cabin with soldiers on the back left side, and he is our people's choice. And if you look at the right side, the cabin is the clearer side, the cleaner side. We've tried to clean them both equitably, but the backside is more tarnished. But you can see that here is a medallion for the presidential campaign of William Henry Harrison, the winner of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so here he's campaigning in 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. This medallion becomes highly significant because not only is it a museum piece just on the value of its own merit, but Ebenezer Robinson, in his return of 1890, tells that he met William Henry Harrison in Cincinnati in the spring of while he was there working on the Book of Mormon, and admired the gentleman, and determined that he definitely wanted to be able to support him. And so for him to bring a medallion to the Times and Seasons building, for him to lose it there, and for us to find it these hundreds of years later, is rather a phenomenal confirmation of the fire in his bones. And so I wanted to tell that fire in the bones story, because that's something I think that the Armstrong ladies have, is something that Terry has when he comes to dig with me. It's just fascinating how volunteers who want to get something done get a fire in their bones that allows them to get it done. All right. I shut down. All right, back to the gallery. Questions, comments? If you'll go down to the reactions, you raise your hand on the reactions, and that way Deb can keep track of who's in order. Or if you want to just wave, then she's pretty good about catching that and keeping people in line anyway. we dumped quite a lot of information on you, but certainly anxious to get your questions and comments.
Okay, one of the Rebeccas maybe has a question. Go ahead, girls.
When was the medallion found? I don't remember seeing that one.
Say it again, please.
When did you find the medallion? I don't remember seeing that one.
Oh, the medallion? That was found by one of the BYU students when they were there in May.
Oh, okay.
This year.
Yeah, I
This-
didn't get to see it.
Oh, you missed it, huh?
Yeah.
It's Western Illinois University. There it's being cleaned, processed, and prepared for museum display.
That's cool.
We have another medallion as well, but this one is the really good one that you can see, read, and tie back to history.
As was mentioned back when I shared the first figure from the civil engineers, we have not gotten permission to publish those, so we won't be publishing right away. If any of you have comments and helps that will make this a better article, we'd appreciate it very much. Other than shortening it, we've already heard that one.
It was a great presentation. Wednesday, go ahead, please.
So you mentioned this a little bit, but I was wondering, like, if there are any specific ways that it affects common narratives, anything that it reveals that, like, socially, that due to, how do I want to say this? Is there any, like, thing that, okay, socially, was there any effect of, like, if it wasn't a swamp, does that affect any, like, narratives or reveal something new, having this proof that this was not a swamp?
I think it speaks of our natural inclination to maintain our traditions. We don't. There's some things we just simply don't question because we've heard them long enough, often enough, that they become embedded as part of our facts, and in actuality, they may not be very accurate. And so I think what we're saying, among other things, is that we need to be cautious to recognize that sometimes our perceptions do not line up very well with reality. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. That answers it. Because I was wondering about, like, stories that people might tell, if anyone did, if it seriously shifted any narratives. But I appreciate that.
It doesn't change the fact that people got sick and died from malaria or ague, but they but to attribute that to the swamp in Nauvoo is a misplacement, because there may very well have been malarial mosquitoes there, but not up. It takes a week for the mosquitoes to breed, and if the water doesn't stay standing in stagnant pools for a week or longer, it's not going to breed mosquitoes.
And malaria doesn't pass from mosquito to mosquito. It can only pass through a human. Well, maybe some other primate, we don't know. You know, malaria is a tropical, subtropical disease. To have it carried up to Nauvoo, mosquitoes didn't do that, humans did.
Well,
Okay.
thank you for the question.
All right, Joetta, and then Earl. Go ahead, please, Joetta.
That was such a wonderful presentation. I just couldn't sit here and not tell you how grateful I am. It's so much that I had no idea about, and it was just so thorough. So thank you so very much. And I do have a question. It's not, well, it's just a plain ordinary question. Having lived in a really, really old house with the limestone basement, when you dug those basements up, because water used to pour through ours sometimes and stay there, did you find water lines that the swampy area had maybe left water in their basements?
If you go to the Hibbard house, that's the house that the Orths have. Their basement, I think, was probably also dry laid. And then they've done, you could follow a number of generations of patchwork there. That's one of the better spots to see what I think you're suggesting. Because yes, and there are those, the fact that the limestone basement walls would often leak, and so therefore you get you get a seasonal problem. But no, in terms of actually seeing any water lines, I have not. But I may have come awful close to that at the Hibbard Orth house. Now it is true that when we did the excavation of this basement in 1975, that there was mortar between the stones, but that was tuck pointed mortar from the Mormon period, not the earlier material that was dry laid.
Thank you. I was just thinking about the discoloration that I had seen over the years. You could tell it was different. So different years there was water in the basement. And that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, that's why I said, well, there's other basements that I think possibly the Clark house would show that as well, but it's always been dark when I've been down there, so that's not something I've seen. But with the Hibbard house, there are a few places where I think you're going to see that in Nauvoo, because you're right. The limestone basements do have a tendency to get wet in the springtime.
Okay, thanks, Joetta. Earl, go ahead, and then Val.
Yeah, it's interesting because when the year I was there, Rebecca was there with me, and it's good to see them again.
Isn't it? Yeah.
What?
I agree. It's so good to see them again. Thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight.
And you had shared with me some of the hypotheses that you're putting together here tonight, and it's an excellent job of putting it into a presentation. And I look forward to the publication of this. Thank you, Paul and David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Earl. Val, and then Terry. Go ahead, please, Val.
I couldn't get my computer to reboot until 15 minutes into the presentation, so maybe you talked about this, but if not, I would suggest that it's likely that the swamp narrative is so durable because it fits into the broader narrative of suffering and persecution. So it's tougher to have to go to a swamp than elsewhere. That the suffering was real, and they were really miserable, and that little detail sort of highlights the suffering. So I think that's probably why it holds on as a, and people are going to be reluctant to drop it because of it's just it has an emotional resonance that fits with the story that we want to tell ourselves.
Wow, thank you, Val. I think that's a very good insight. We did not address that matter at all, but I think that as part of the mythical tradition, mythology is often more powerful than our history. And when we're dealing with myth like this that is that powerful, I agree that it's going to be pretty durable. It has been very durable, but we are wanting to take a shot at it because I think it's not accurate.
Okay. All right, Terry, it's your turn. Go ahead, please.
I first of all want to cut on Val's comment. I think it's a very good one. Another explanation for that, I think, is in 3 weeks, I'll be talking about miracles in the Book of Mormon, There's a lot of miracles in Nauvoo, past and present, that I'm not even going to address, but it's handy for the church to explain the draining of that swamp as a miracle. And that's another way to view it, because I love Paul, the comment about the Durfee ditch, because that's always the church's history is always explained that that's what drained the flat of all the water. And the comment about the pageant, how it got so much water in one night, and 24 hours later you couldn't even tell it had rained, because there's natural underground drainage in there. I've been in the basement of 3 historic houses doing archaeology, and none of them had a water problem. And so the water table now is really considerably lower than it might have been then. That's something somebody needs to go test. But anyway, so there's a lot of non-water on the flats in Nauvoo right now. So it's definitely you can't see a swamp at all whatsoever in the flat. And I think it just got drained naturally and with the Durfee ditch rather quickly. But the myth has held for years.
What 3 basements, Terry?
The basement of the bakery, Stoddard Bakery, Browning House, and what's the third one? The basement of Lion Drugstore.
And Lion.
So those buildings, when they were built with basements.
Lion only partially, but the others were. I mean, the bakery, a person needs to go into the Stoddard Bakery and see how beautiful that is, because there were 2 ovens in there, and where the ovens are, it was a brick flooring, and then the other half of the basement that wasn't where the ovens were was a natural clay for it, that yellow clay that's so common in Nauvoo. That was all clay in that area. So that thing has a natural thing to just suck up water in there, and it's not there. It doesn't happen in the Stoddard Bakery.
Wow. Thank you.
Another factor that occurred to me is that we do not know of any wells that were dug out in that area. We haven't looked. Were there any other wells dug out in the rest of the terrace?
Yeah.
Anybody know?
Terry would know about the Browning one.
Yeah, what most people don't know is in the kitchen area of the Browning, there's a well in there. And in 1968, I was the smallest person of the crew. And so I got the nod to go down in that and clear out all the artifacts and other things that are in there. And when I was back in Nauvoo as a missionary in 2017, I found those same artifacts. So the gobs of clay that they were in have never been processed. They're exactly like I got them out of the water. But anyway, that well was not used as a well. It was used as a refrigerator, because in the kitchen you could lower cheese and milk and whatever you wanted to preserve just down a little ways, keep it above the water, and it keeps it cool in there. And the water kept coming in as I'm digging in there, and I just had to scrape out the stuff, put it in a bucket, and then hauled it up. The bottom of that well is probably 8 feet below the kitchen level, and probably 6 or 5 feet below the current ground level in the Browning house. And so there's a water table there in 68 that was just very active. When I dig around it, the water would get murky, and we just wait a few minutes and water would come in and go out, and I could see again and whatnot. So that's the most remarkable basement thing I've been in. I've also been in the basement of Times and Sea of the cultural hall, the Masonic hall. And I helped excavate for a little bit in there, and it was the same story. It was this yellow clay, just like right next door in the bakery, And there was no water in the basement in 1968 when I was there.
You're mentioning the artifacts unprocessed. Triggered for me to tell a story. When I when I retired in 2014, started assisting Paul in Nauvoo, I discovered that artifacts were being bagged, and Paul ended up taking most of them home to try to get them processed. And he would discover on some of the labels, here's a label for a bunch of artifacts from a square that wasn't dug. And those kind of problems, and how do you deal with that? And so I proceeded to develop a technique where we did the artifact cleaning right on the site as they were dug up. Well, you would dig a level, and then you would take your level to the cleaning table, and people then would clean the artifacts to have them ready, clean them and label them so that we would know what they were, and nobody had to take them home and try to process them afterward and hoping we had the right things. And as I was doing that, 4 people came in, 4 ladies, Mary, Rebecca, and Rebecca. And they were super at beginning that process of cleaning artifacts right on site. And they have been our very best volunteers through the years. I really appreciated them stepping right in there and making my new system of cleaning artifacts on the site very effective.
That's a good check mechanism. Thank you.
We're at 9:30, ladies and gentlemen, and that could very well be a closing time, but if there's more questions and comments, I would yield to them. If not, we sing it out. Freely, freely you have received, freely, freely give. Go in my name, and because you believe, others will know that I live. I think that message of how freely we have been blessed, and how important it is for us to extend that compassion to others, is a message that, even though sometimes we get caught with our traditions that are not quite accurate, we do need to continue to look to refine and learn the language of compassion to make a better world. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah, everybody.